All right, so get this. Imagine paying more for your morning coffee because of copper prices, not oil prices.
Sounds crazy, right?
Totally. But that's just one of the wild things we're uncovering in this deep dive. All thanks to the mountain of reports and data you sent over. IMF reports, economic outlooks, the whole shebang.
It's like the ultimate cheat sheet for understanding where the global economy is headed.
Exactly. So whether you're prepping for that big presentation or just a huge econ nerd like me, we're breaking down the IMF's October 2024 World Economic Outlook.
Think of it as your guide to the forces shaping our world.
Okay, so let's zoom out and look at the big picture first. The IMF is saying global growth should stay around 3% until 2029. On the surface, that doesn't sound too bad.
Yeah, but there's a catch, right?
Yeah, tell me.
The 3% is actually lower than what they were projecting before the pandemic,
So it's like the pandemic and the war, they've left a mark.
Yeah, exactly. Some lasting scars on the global economy. It's not just a temporary blip. It's like the world is still adjusting.
Reshaping itself almost. So does that mean everyone is feeling this equally?
Not really. They're seeing kind of a split. Advanced economies, they're expected to see some growth. But the euro area, they're facing some headwinds, probably because they're so close to what's happening in Ukraine.
Right, makes sense.
But those emerging markets, they're having a tougher time. IMF says the pace of structural reforms is a big factor there.
Yeah, makes sense. Europe's dealing with that war fallout more directly. And those structural reforms, man, those are key for growth in the long term, but they're tough to pull off. We should come back to that. I bet the IMF has some interesting stuff to say about that. But first, we got to talk about inflation.
Right. It's the big buzzword. Global inflation has actually calmed down from that peak back in 22, quicker than a lot of folks expected.
So are we finally out of the woods? Can we all breathe a sigh of relief?
Well, hold on. Not so fast. Things are moving in the right direction, yeah. But there are still some kinks to work out.
Like what?
Well, one thing that's super interesting is how service prices are acting.
Ooh, yeah. People are finally traveling, eating out, doing all the fun stuff again. Why are those prices still so high?
Seems like a lot of it boils down to wages.
Yeah.
Cost of living went up. People needed more money to keep up, right?
Makes sense.
But then those higher wages, they can push service prices up even more.
Yeah.
Which then might lead to people demanding even higher wages. You see where this is going?
Okay, so are we on the verge of that dreaded wage price spiral everyone's been freaking out about?
It's a valid concern, for sure.
Yeah.
But the IMF doesn't think it's a done deal.
Huh.
They're saying this kind of wage catch-up, it's normal after you have a period of high inflation. It doesn't always go crazy.
Phew. Okay, that is a relief. A little cautious optimism never hurts. But this brings up another question. How are governments and central banks dealing with this whole crazy roller coaster?
That's where we get to the policy pivot. It's a bit of a mess right now. We've got this stark contrast between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Remember how central banks around the world have been tightening monetary policy to fight inflation? Well, at the same time, fiscal policy, government spending and taxes, that's stayed pretty loose, even expanding in some places.
So it's like one foot on the gas, one on the brake. Not exactly a smooth ride.
Perfect analogy. And you're right, it's confusing. It makes it way harder for those central banks to get inflation under control, and it slows down the rebuilding of those fiscal buffers.
Wait, back up. Fiscal buffers. For those of us who don't speak economist, what exactly are we talking about here?
Right, sorry. Think of it like a government's rainy day fund. Extra cash they've got stashed away for unexpected stuff, natural disasters, pandemics, you name it. When those buffers are gone, governments have less wiggle room to deal with crises without doing things like slashing spending or racking up more debt.
Got it. So it's like a financial cushion for when things get rough. Makes sense. So back to this policy mismatch. Is that part of why the dollar's been so strong lately?
It's definitely playing a role. That combo of tight monetary policy and loose fiscal policy, it's really obvious in the U.S., and it's a big factor in the dollar getting stronger this year.
Okay, so the strong dollar, it's partly a result of this policy dance. Makes sense. Now let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about something that might seem a little random. Metals.
Ooh, I was wondering when we get to this.
I know, right? Might seem weird to bring up copper and aluminum when we're talking global economy, but I trust you. There's got to be a reason.
Okay, so think about it. This huge push for green energy, it's changing everything. We're used to oil being the thing that causes all the economic drama, but as we shift to renewables, the demand for some metals, it's going to go through the roof.
Wait, are you saying metals are the new oil? That's a pretty bold statement.
Maybe a bit of an oversimplification, but it highlights a crucial point. We're talking solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicle batteries, all that stuff needs tons of metals.
Okay, so it's not just the quantity, it's specific types of metals, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Copper, aluminum, lithium. They're not just for smartphones anymore. They're the building blocks for electric grids, power storage, all kinds of high-tech stuff. The IMF research actually points out how vital these metals are for investment goods, especially things like electrical equipment and machinery.
So instead of worrying about oil price shocks, we need to be thinking about metal price shocks. That's a pretty big mental shift. What would that even look like?
Well, the IMF actually dug into that. They compared metal price shocks to the oil ones we're more familiar with. And get this, they found that disruptions to metal supply can have a delayed effect on inflation, but it lasts way longer.
Whoa, okay, that's a wake-up call. So this green transition, which is obviously a good thing, it's going to come with some economic side effects that we need to be ready for. It's not just about cutting emissions, it's about managing this whole new set of challenges.
Exactly. It's like trading one set of problems for another, but hopefully for a more sustainable future.
And speaking of the green transition, there's another big change happening that we need to talk about: electric vehicles. All right, let's talk EVs. What's the IMF's take on how this is all playing out globally?
They're saying it's not just a trend, it's a fundamental shift in the auto industry. We're not just talking about a few more EVs on the road, we're talking about a change that impacts everything. Investment, production, trade, jobs, all of it. And on a massive scale.
But let's give me a real-world example. How could this actually play out?
Well, the IMF modeled a scenario where the EU goes all in on electric vehicles by 2035. It's really interesting. Their models show that there might be a little dip in GDP in the medium term as everyone adjusts, but there could also be some really interesting shifts in purchasing power and trade, depending on how reliant each country is on imported EVs.
So it's a mixed bag, potentially some downsides at first, but also some cool opportunities for those who can adapt fast.
Exactly. It's all about being quick and innovative. And you know what? This brings us right back to something we talked about earlier, structural reforms.
Right, those big, often painful but necessary changes. Why are these reforms so crucial now with all this stuff happening globally?
Well, think about it. We've got the green transition, aging populations, and so much more going on. Structural reforms are the tools we need to adapt and thrive in this crazy changing world. But here's the catch. Actually getting those reforms passed, that's a whole different story.
Why is that? If they're so important, why are they so hard to put into action?
IMF found that since the 2008 financial crisis, the pace of reform has slowed way down. And a big reason for that is public resistance. People don't always like big changes, especially when they seem disruptive or uncertain.
So it's not just about the economics, it's about human nature, right? People get anxious, they resist change.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. The IMF found that this resistance to reform, it often goes beyond just self-interest. It's about perceptions, misinformation, and a lack of trust in the institutions trying to make these changes.
So how do you overcome that? How do you get people on board with changes that might be uncomfortable in the short term, but good for everyone in the long run?
Well, the IMF has some really valuable insights here. They looked at different approaches to implementing reforms and found some strategies that can make a big difference. It all starts with understanding how people react to change. One of the most effective strategies is clear communication. People need to understand why these reforms are necessary and how they'll work, and what the benefits are, not just for the economy overall, but for them personally.
Yeah, but that's easier said than done, right? How do you explain these complicated economic policies in a way that regular people get? It's not exactly dinner table conversation.
You got to cut through all the jargon and just focus on how it affects people in the real world, use language they understand, and examples that make sense. It's also super important to address their concerns head on and acknowledge that, yeah, change can be scary. It's all about building trust and making sure people feel like they're part of the process, not just having it dictated to them.
So it's about transparency, empathy, and bringing people along on the journey.
You got it. Another key piece is dealing with those distributional concerns we talked about. Whenever a reform is going to create winners and losers, and let's be honest, that's usually the case, you have to have ways to help those who might end up worse off.
That's a really important point. It's about making sure everyone benefits fairly and no one gets left behind.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, it all boils down to trust in institutions. If people don't trust the government or the experts, they're not going to support these changes.
So transparency, accountability, open dialogue, those are the keys to building that trust.
Absolutely. The IMF's research really emphasizes the importance of talking to stakeholders, doing independent research to back up claims, and having strong institutions that encourage real dialogue and engagement.
So it's not just about the policy itself, it's about the process and how you involve the public. It's about making people feel heard and respected, which, that's just good practice for anything, really.
Couldn't agree more. It all comes back to that human element we talked about. Economics, it's not just numbers on a page. It's about how people make choices, especially when things are uncertain and changing. And speaking of uncertainty, let's go back to those global growth projections for a sec. Remember, the IMF said growth should be around 3% until 2029.
Yeah, those kind of gloomy numbers. What about them? Is there a chance things could be even worse?
Well, remember, those are just the base projections. The IMF also looked at a bunch of different scenarios, good and bad, that could really shake things up. Think of it like a choose-your-own-adventure for the global economy.
Okay, now I'm really interested. What are some of the scenarios that could really change things?
They looked at a bunch of stuff, but two scenarios really stood out to me. The first one is a hypothetical increase in global trade tensions and tariffs. Remember those trade wars we had a few years back? Not a fun time.
Definitely not. So is the IMF saying we're headed back in that direction?
They're not making predictions, but their model shows that if that were to happen, global growth would take a big hit. More tariffs and trade barriers mean disruptions to global supply chains, businesses get spooked, and ultimately everyone invests less and the economy slows down.
Ouch, sounds like a lose-lose situation. Definitely not the path we want to be on. What's the other scenario they looked at?
This one's a bit more optimistic. It focuses on two main things: rebalancing in China and more public investment in the EU.
Okay, hold on. What does rebalancing in China even mean?
Basically, it means shifting away from an economic model that relies heavily on exports and investment and moving towards one that's more focused on domestic consumption. The IMF modeled a scenario where China improves its social safety net, which would lead to people saving less.
So if people feel more secure, they're more likely to spend money instead of hoarding it. Makes sense to me. And what about the EU side of things? What kind of public investment are we talking about?
They looked at a big increase in public investment in the EU, specifically in infrastructure, research and development, and green technologies. That kind of investment would boost the economy in the short term, but it would also make the EU more competitive and productive in the long run.
Sounds like a win-win to me. So bottom line,
Well,
how do these two very different scenarios affect those global growth projections we talked about?
the result's pretty clear. If we go down the road of more trade tensions, global growth takes a hit. It falls even further below those baseline projections. But if China rebalances and the EU invests more, we see a big jump in global growth, well above those baseline projections.
So the takeaway here is that our choices really matter. If countries work together and invest in the future, we could be looking at a much brighter economic outlook.
Absolutely. It really highlights the fact that there are multiple paths forward, and the decisions we make today will have a huge impact on the world of tomorrow.
And it underscores the importance of staying informed and involved. We can't just sit back and let these big economic forces control our lives. We need to understand them, question them, and make our voices heard in the conversations that will shape our collective future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more interesting thing from the IMF's research that I think you'll find pretty fascinating. It goes back to that inflation puzzle we were talking about earlier. The IMF took a deep dive into the recent global inflation episode, the one we're still dealing with, and they found some really interesting insights into how inflation actually works in the real world.
Okay, you've got my attention. We know that inflation is caused by a lot of different factors, but what new insights did the IMF bring to the table?
They really zoomed in on the role of sectoral price changes and how they interact with overall inflation. Remember how we talked about service price inflation being stickier than goods price inflation?
Yeah, it's like those service prices just refuse to budge.
Exactly. Well, the IMF found that this price stickiness is different across different parts of the economy. Some sectors have prices that change quickly based on supply and demand, while others have prices that are much more resistant to change.
Okay, I'm following so far, but how does this relate to the bigger picture of inflation?
This is where it gets interesting. The IMF's research shows that when those sectors with very flexible prices experience a shock, like energy prices going up because of a war, it can actually cause a ripple effect of price increases across the entire economy.
So it's like a domino effect. One price shock triggers a chain reaction.
Exactly. And this effect can be even stronger if there are supply problems across the economy. If businesses are already having trouble keeping up with demand and then they get hit with higher costs from those flexible price sectors, it creates a perfect storm for inflation to spread.
So this sectoral analysis gives us a whole new way of understanding inflation. It's not just about the overall balance of supply and demand. It's about how different parts of the economy interact and how those interactions can make price shocks worse.
You got it. And this has big implications for how central banks should respond to inflation. If they only look at the overall inflation numbers without considering what's happening in different sectors, they might overreact or underreact, which could lead to unintended consequences.
So they need a more nuanced and targeted approach that considers the unique characteristics of different sectors and how they contribute to overall inflation.
Exactly. And this leads to another fascinating insight from the IMF, the potential benefits of focusing on core inflation instead of headline inflation. Have you heard of that distinction before?
To be honest, not really. What's the difference between core and headline inflation, and why would we want to target one over the other?
Well, headline inflation is the number we usually hear about in the news. It includes the prices of everything in the economy, from groceries to haircuts to plane tickets. Core inflation, on the other hand, doesn't include those volatile food and energy prices.
So core inflation is like a smoothed-out version of headline inflation, less sensitive to those big swings we see in energy and food costs, kind of like taking the temperature of the economy without those chills and fever spikes.
Perfect analogy. The IMF's research suggests that targeting core inflation can actually create a more stable and predictable economic environment, especially when those flexible price sectors are causing a lot of volatility in headline inflation. It's about focusing on the underlying trends, not the short-term noise.
Makes sense. But wouldn't ignoring those swings in food and energy prices make people feel like the economic data is out of touch with their everyday lives? After all, those are the prices they see every time they go to the grocery store or fill up their gas tank.
I get it. It's a valid concern. But here's the thing. Monetary policy can't really control those volatile food and energy prices. Those are mostly driven by global supply and demand, things that are outside the control of any single central bank.
So trying to fight those price swings with monetary policy is like trying to stop a hurricane with a fly swatter.
Exactly. It's a lot more effective to focus on those underlying inflation pressures in the core economy, the ones that monetary policy can actually influence, and let those volatile food and energy prices work themselves out.
That's an interesting perspective. It really highlights how limited monetary policy can be and how important it is to have realistic expectations about what it can and can't do.
Right. It's about putting your efforts where they can have the biggest impact and recognizing that sometimes the best thing to do is just ride out the storm and let those temporary price fluctuations run their course.
This deep dive has been quite a journey, from global growth projections to the complexities of sectoral price dynamics and the nuances of monetary policy. It's a lot to take in, but it's clear that the global economy is in a really interesting, if somewhat unpredictable phase. It's a bit like navigating a jungle, exciting, challenging, and full of surprises around every corner.
It really is. It's this dynamic, ever-changing system, and like we've been talking about, it's all connected to how people act, the choices governments make, what's happening in the world.
So true. Okay, before we wrap up, gotta ask the question that's probably on everyone's mind right now. What does all this mean for me? For the average person trying to make sense of all this economic stuff, how do I actually use this to make good decisions?
That's the million-dollar question. The whole point of this deep dive is to give you the knowledge you need to make smart choices. So here are a few key things to remember as you navigate the economic jungle out there.
Lay it on me. What are the takeaways?
First, remember those long-term trends we talked about. Global growth might be slow in the short term, but that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities out there. You got to look past the headlines and find those pockets of growth and innovation.
So it's like being an economic detective, right? Looking for clues that others might miss.
Exactly. And a lot of times, those clues lead to emerging markets. They may have challenges, but they also have huge potential for growth and innovation. It's higher risk, but the rewards could be big.
Got it. Don't be afraid to explore those emerging markets. What else?
Second takeaway. Think strategically about how all these global shifts will affect your industry, your job, your investments. Are you ready for the electric vehicle revolution? Have you thought about how those metal price swings could impact things?
So it's about being proactive, not reactive. Looking ahead, anticipating those changes, and adapting your strategies.
Exactly. And finally, remember that you have a voice. The choices we make individually and collectively really do matter. Pay attention to those policy debates, understand the different perspectives, and make your voice heard. Whether it's how you vote, what you buy, or how you engage in your community, your actions can shape the future.
Because ultimately, we're all part of this economic system, right? Our choices impact each other and the world around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, I know we've covered a ton today, but I want to leave you with one final thought, a question to chew on. We talked about how metals might be the new oil, how this whole shift to green energy is creating a whole new economic reality. So here's the question. What does that mean for you? Are you ready for the possibility of price swings in those essential metals? What opportunities might come up because of this change? And how can you set yourself up to not just survive, but actually thrive in a world where the green transition is changing everything?
Big questions, but the right ones to be asking. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about, a foundation for understanding what's going on in the world. But now it's up to each of us to take this knowledge and make smart choices that will shape our economic future.
I totally agree. The global economy is complex and always changing, but with a little knowledge, a curious mind, and a willingness to adapt, we can all navigate it successfully.
And on that note, that wraps up our deep dive into the IMF's World Economic Outlook. We hope you enjoyed it and that you feel a little more prepared to face those economic challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
See you next time.